So in this video, I'm going to tell you about one of my favorite psychology theories, moral foundations theory. As the kids say, it's a problematic fave. Actually, is that something people younger than me say? Or is it like a millennial thing? Or am I just not cool or saying it cringy now? I don't know, but I'm hoping my self-deprecation here will guard me against ridicule. Anyway, welcome back to Political Psych with Abby. I'm Abby, and on this channel we talk about the psychology of politics. I've talked about moral foundations theory before, but I want to go into more depth, and my viewers want me to too, so here goes. Basically, moral foundations theory is a theory within psychology aimed at explaining why morality and concepts of virtue vary across cultures or people. Moral foundations theory stands on four main claims. The first claim is nativism, meaning in this context that humans have innate moral structures, which are then built on and shaped by experience. Essentially, people can learn many moral concepts, but they learn some more readily than others. The second claim is cultural learning. This is the idea that a person's morality is shaped by their culture, especially during development. Together, these basically amount to the idea that an individual's morality is the result of both nature and nurture. The third claim is intuitionism, which in this context is the idea that people usually have moral intuitions first and consciously reason deliberately about them second. The fourth claim is pluralism, the idea that our evolutionary ancestors faced many social challenges and therefore over time developed many moral foundations to deal with them. Pluralism has, in my view, been the most influential element of moral foundations theory, and is the main thing that sets it apart from other theories. Moral pluralism is an aspect of the theory that many researchers, especially in the political realm, have focused on. At the moment, there are 5 moral foundations typically considered to be part of moral foundations theory, although the theory leaves itself open to others being found. The 5 moral foundations are, drumroll please, care, for example, looking out for the weak and vulnerable, is in line with this foundation. Fairness, this could be something like giving someone their rights. Loyalty, this could be something like patriotism. Authority, for example, obeying your leaders. And sanctity, which would include things like chastity. Now, you may think that loyalty, authority, or sanctity are not inherent moral goods, and I don't either, but trust me, we are going to get into that later, so stay tuned. Also, I should mention that these foundations get called a lot of different names, so I'm going with what I view as the simplest and most straightforward versions of the names. Moral foundations theory was originally developed by Haidt and Jost to explain variations in virtue concepts across cultures and eras, not variation in political ideology. But, what do you know, it turns out politics has a lot to do with the way people think about morality, which is why I'm talking about it here. So, I should probably mention at this point that Jonathan Haidt, who is probably the most famous person associated with this theory, is one of the reasons why this theory is a problematic fave. Before anyone accuses me of canceling him, and he's very concerned with things like that, so this is important, I am going to say that I in fact encourage you to read his book, Righteous Minds. It is a great book, very well written, and was one of the first political psychology books I ever read. I'm not even telling you not to spend your money on that book, but feel free to get it from the library or something. I don't think he's desperate for cash. My first inklings of a problem with Haidt is something I realized near the end of his book, where he gets very both sidesy. Now, in no way am I arguing for a one-party or one ideology state. However, Haidt seems to argue that liberals, and he defines that to include those on the left of liberals, and conservatives are moral equals, or if anything, that conservatives may be more morally able. This is a sort of theoretically neat thing. The sort of thing that looks good in a diagram or in a quote, but does not gel with how the world, especially America, with which he is primarily concerned, seems to be. I will get more into why I disagree with this take on moral foundations theory when I go more in depth about the theory itself. What is more unfortunate is that he seems to have largely spent the year since the publication of Righteous Minds concerned with things like campus free speech, trigger warnings, and the problems of campus safe spaces. Can I just say that I went to college after Haidt started writing about this stuff and literally never encountered a safe space or a trigger warning? And I literally studied both genocide and suicide, sometimes in the same week. I don't know why people think these are everywhere. The only explicit safe spaces I encountered were in middle and high school, where some teachers had LGBT safe space stickers up, and I think all that meant is that those teachers wouldn't let someone bully someone for being gay or trans. And let me tell you, I had trans friends in high school and they still got bullied. I should mention that I did attend college in Scotland, but friends in the US have had similar experiences to me, and it's not like no one in Britain is alarmed about wokeness and such. In case you're wondering, the main reason why I put warnings on parts of my videos is because one of my videos may have literally auto-played after a video of kittens, and I don't feel like randomly slapping someone in the face with upsetting topics. It feels rude. Anyway, I did make myself read Haidt's Atlantic article, The Coddling of the American Mind, but I could not make myself read his book by the same title, as I find these topics deeply tedious. He makes some decent points in the article. I also think that we should let children play more freely and take more risks, and that certain campus activists are occasionally silly and annoying. I'm not going to pick through the whole article because I do not run a debate channel and I do not do drama and callouts. My main point is honestly that focusing on the few cherry-picked incidents of cancel culture or political correctness run amok is a massive waste of time, and the time of someone like Haidt is valuable. I know quite a few academics, both because I work in academia and because I have family in academia. As far as I can tell, the way this works is that one incident of something silly happens at a university, it gets picked up and often distorted by a publication a lot of people in academia read, like say the New York Times, and then they all forward the article to each other and end all panicky and distracted for a couple weeks before the next one comes along. These articles are basically clickbait for the intellectually influential. Occasionally, an academic will actually have to deal with someone taking a silly approach to activism in a way that affects them, or a university administration taking an ineffective approach to helping marginalized people. But I find that it is much better to deal with this internally rather than by writing sweeping articles like this one. And I want to clarify, most academics do not write sweeping articles like this one because they have the good sense not to do their office politics in the Atlantic. I do also think that representing what I'm going to call silly approaches to activism as both a larger threat to intellectual culture than they are and more prevalent than they actually are undercuts actually important activism and even just basic HR practices on campuses and elsewhere. Basically, I think Haidt is wasting his time and not inconsiderable talents on this, and is probably doing at least some harm by it. I bet it pays well, though. Haidt is also very concerned with ideological diversity, both in social psychology and in academia as a whole. I will fully admit that most social psychologists, myself included, are left of center. I actually don't object to more right-leaning people getting involved. It's hard to research right-wingers. Like, they are literally less likely to answer survey questions, so basically anything we could do to help with that would be good. However, as part of this, Haidt seems to take the view that social psychology should be totally unideological. While I believe we should endeavor to be unbiased while collecting and analyzing data, there are a lot of topics in social psychology that are exceedingly politically and ideologically fraught. If social psychology is going to have any real world impact, that impact must be on societal problems that some people may not actually believe are problems or, in fact, may believe are good things. For example, you could apply social psychology to disenfranchising minority voters. And I would really not want to share a department with someone who wanted to do that. However, wanting to do that is definitely in line with some shockingly common ideologies in America. Should that ideology be included and celebrated in academia? Personally, I'm going to go with no. I also want to mention that I do not want to set an expectation that I will tell you anywhere near this much about the reputation and politics of academics I cite here. Typically, I do not know that much about them, except that they wrote a useful and interesting article in a respected publication. The only reason I'm doing this with Haidt is that he is enough of a public figure and has made what I mentioned before a big part of his public profile. And if he goes full Jordan Peterson, I want to be on the record about this stuff. I was trying to have that be much shorter, but my editor told me I had to leave it in, so you can take it up with him. Anyway, back to why moral foundations theory is so useful in explaining politics, even though it may not constitute a scientifically or philosophically perfect theory. The most useful element is definitely the moral pluralism aspect, but we should probably make sure the other pillars are not at imminent risk of toppling over before we get into that. Let's start with if political ideology is innate. If it was based on moral foundations, we would expect it to be. For the innateness element of moral foundations theory to be true, people would have to be predisposed to certain political ideologies. But this would not mean that experience would not shape political ideology. Research into genetics suggests that predisposition to certain political tendencies is highly genetic, and in fact, I've done a whole video about this. This heritability is reflected in the higher levels of political similarity between identical twins than between fraternal twins and siblings. One mechanism for the innateness of politics could be the innateness of moral foundations. This suggests that political ideology is at least somewhat innate and in line with moral foundations theory. Although, interestingly, while the evidence that political tendencies may be linked to genetics is fairly robust, there are doubts about the heritability of moral foundations themselves. In a study by Smith et al., 2017, no significant evidence was found for any of the moral foundations being heritable. This does not mean that they are not built on heritable foundations. But wait, did I just imply foundations of foundations? Well, I guess that could totally be a thing. Think of like the human mind and system of morality like one of those old cities that is just built on more of itself. Like, we can still be born with some scaffolding on which our later morality can be built, without the individual foundations being heritable. Still, further study into the innateness of moral foundations as they relate to political ideology is needed. So, if not all political differences are attributable to genetics, and politics vary across culture, it is at least likely that politics are somewhat culturally learned. Interestingly, this does not appear to be one of the things that much of the literature on moral foundations theory and political ideology focuses on. This might be because if cultural learning influences politics in a way consistent with moral foundations theory, it probably does so via cultural values. So basically, if moral foundations vary across cultures, that means that they basically have to be culturally learned. It's not really something that has to be proved separately. I'm not sure I'm explaining this well, but basically it's so obvious that you don't have to write literature about it. Still, there is fairly robust evidence people have actually bothered collecting that parents and other authority figures may work to instill different values dependent on culture. There is also evidence that where someone is from in the world may influence which moral foundations they endorse. In addition, if political ideology is not culturally learned, but is still based in moral foundations that are culturally learned, then moral foundations theory would still succeed as a theory of political ideology. This suggests that provided political ideology is linked to morality, it is at least in part culturally learned. So let's move on to whether political ideology is consistent with the intuitionism element of moral foundations theory. In this context, intuitionism would mean that political ideologies have a relationship to moral foundations that should be measurable by means which require participants to make snap judgments. When liberal versus conservative ideology was measured via an implicit association test, this implicit ideology predicted agreement with judgments related to moral foundations even more than participants' explicitly stated ideology. And Van Leeuwen and Park found links between endorsement of loyalty, authority, and sanctity and explicitly and implicitly measured conservatism. Yeah, Basically, we are not all the deep thinkers we think we are. A lot of it is just after the fact justification for snap judgments. However detrimental this might be for political discourse, it is probably a good thing that we intuitively know things like murder are wrong without having to think too deeply about it. The moral pluralism aspect of moral foundations theory and the associated five foundations are the aspect of the theory that most researchers in the political realm focus on. This is likely because the possibility of multiple and varying moral foundations, if it were true, has the potential to explain so much of politics. Like, seriously, this is so useful. Using a variety of measures, Graham, Haidt, and Nozick found that liberals and conservatives in the United States rely on different moral foundations, and this was true across a variety of measures. Conservatives were found to be more likely to draw on the loyalty, authority, and sanctity foundations, while liberals were more likely to draw on the care and fairness foundations. Similar results were found using data from the yourmorals.org test, which allowed for the collection of a larger and more diverse data set. You can take the Your Morals test yourself if you want. I will link it below, though I would caution you against trying to understand your own politics based on any kind of test. These are typically designed for social scientists to understand the politics of large populations rather than for individuals to understand their own politics. If you want to understand this in the context of a much worse test you can find on the internet, check out my video on the political compass. I'll link that in the corner. I actually tried to have the high school students I was teaching this summer do the Your Morals test, but you have to be 18 and they did not want to break the rules. They were really obeying the authority moral foundation there. I guess I could have used my authority to tell them to break the rules, but that's usually something teachers are discouraged from doing. Anyway, there is also evidence that ideologies other than liberal/left-leaning and conservative have their own tendencies when it comes to moral foundations and what they gravitate towards. Haidt et al. Found that the moral profile of people on the religious left included more focus on loyalty, authority, and sanctity than secular liberals, and higher levels of emphasis on care and fairness than social conservatives. This is consistent with the religious left having its own political ideology. Libertarians have presented a unique challenge for moral foundations theory. Libertarians do seem to have their own moral profile when measured on the five foundations. Their low levels of moral concern about harm and fairness are similar to conservatives, and their low levels of concern for the in-group loyalty foundation, the authority foundation, and the purity foundation is similar to liberals. This might prompt people to ask if libertarians are simply less moral. Iyer et al. Propose an alternative possibility, that libertarians might rely on economic and lifestyle liberties as their guiding moral principle. It is worth noting that if this were true, it would not disprove moral foundations theory, as the theory leaves itself open to new foundations being found. However, it may mean that its current form is incomplete in terms of explaining political ideology. In terms of my own views on the morals of libertarians, and conservatives for that matter, well, let's just say that'll be made clear soon. Moral pluralism is the aspect of moral foundations theory that is particularly hotly debated, especially as it relates to political ideology. I'm going to start with the more scientific criticisms and then move on to the more moral and philosophical ones, although I think you might be able to guess what some of those are already. One of the main scientific criticisms is the idea that there is basically just one moral foundation, that being that we should not cause harm. This falls very neatly under the care foundation. In fact, this foundation is often called the care-harm foundation. Gray, Young, and Waits posit that all morality is actually based in perceptions of harm. They argue that this includes ostensibly harmless acts like purity violations. Such purity harms that do not cause material harm would include things like the violation of kosher law, but also a lot of weird hypotheticals that make you say, yuck, involving people, say, interacting with immediate relatives and dead chickens, but no one being hurt. I genuinely think describing these scenarios may get me age-restricted, so I'm not going to here. Gray, Shine, and Ward found that ostensibly harmless wrongs are still perceived as having victims, activate concepts of harm, and increase perceived suffering. Shine and Gray extend this argument to the political realm and argue that there are not, in fact, deep cognitive differences between liberals and conservatives, and that instead they view different things as harmful. They provide considerable evidence that harm is in fact central to moral cognition regardless of politics. And they also demonstrate that other foundations may overlap considerably with harm. While it is very true that different people and cultures likely perceive different things as harmful, this theory does not necessarily account for all morality. Graham et al. Rightly point out that this does not account for things like the role of disgust in moral decision-making. In addition, this purely harm-based morality cannot account for studies like those conducted by Inbar, Pizarro, and Cushman, wherein people were deemed worthy of blame even if they were not seen as having actually harmed anyone. In addition, there is a chance that people may be adjusting their harm perceptions to their moral foundations or political ideology. There is also a case to be made that moral foundations theory would still help us to understand political ideology, even if what it posits to be differences in moral foundations are actually differences in what people perceive as harmful. As an additional criticism, Kugler, Jost, and Noorbaloochi propose that liberal-conservative differences in moral judgments are mediated by authoritarianism and social dominance orientation. Authoritarianism in this context is a personality variable, meaning being highly submissive to authority figures, acting aggressively on behalf of those authorities, and being traditional and conformist in one's thoughts and actions. Social dominance orientation is the amount of hierarchy someone wants there to be in their society. So someone high in social dominance orientation would want to live in a very hierarchical society. Federico, Weber, Ergun, and Hunt did find that the care and fairness foundations were associated with being low in social dominance orientation, and the in-group authority and purity foundations were associated with right-wing authoritarianism and belief in a dangerous world. Belief in a dangerous world is exactly what it sounds like, by the way. I talk way more about it in my video on the psychology of the gun control debate, but I warn you that this is the second video I ever made, and while I stand by the research, I do not stand by the production quality. Anyway, back on topic. Federico et al. See this association between other variables and the moral foundations as an aspect of moral foundations theory, rather than a reason to discredit it. However, Kugler et al. Argue that the connection of certain moral foundations to authoritarianism and social dominance orientation does discredit them. They argue that conservative intuitions may have more to do with personality dynamics and ideological differences, such as those linked to authoritarianism and social dominance orientation, than anything that could be defended reasonably or successfully as an objective moral principle. Whether personality factors such as right-wing authoritarianism, belief in a dangerous world, and social dominance orientation constitute an alternative to moral foundations theory, or something that could be integrated into moral foundations theory, is an open question. However, I think they have a good point that authoritarianism and high social dominance orientation cannot possibly be defended as moral, and that brings me to the criticisms of moral foundations on moral grounds. Kugler, Jost, and Noorbaloochi question whether moral pluralism and broadening the scientific idea of what is moral is a good idea. I also question this. Wait, this is a YouTube video. I can say things directly. I think a lot of actions could be in line with the in-group authority and purity foundations while being extremely immoral. Kugler et al. Raise extremely valid concerns that the in-group authority and purity foundations are associated with intergroup hostility and support for discrimination. And I don't feel the need to listen to anyone who thinks intergroup hostility and discrimination are good things. In addition, differences between liberals and conservatives on moral matters is largely mediated by authoritarianism and social dominance orientation, both of which are, like, bad. There is also plenty of compelling data to indicate that right-wing moral and political approaches in and of themselves correlate to authoritarianism, prejudice, and discrimination against members of disadvantaged groups. However, only some academics will out and out say that because, unlike YouTube, much of academia attempts political neutrality, something I will not be attempting in this video. Haidt and Graham, two researchers key to moral foundations theory, do argue that the additional moral foundations on which conservatives tend to put more emphasis than liberals should be treated as moral instead of amoral, immoral, or just plain stupid. I think they view this as a sort of sensible middle-of-the-road apolitical take. But I view it as conceding an honestly dangerous amount of ground to the right. What I wrote in the academic essay this video is based on is, the idea of broadening our understanding of morality to include these foundations is absolutely worthy of debate, although to some extent that debate is more political and philosophical than scientific. What I'll say now is that there are definitely some moral foundations, or at least aspects of foundations, that should not be understood as morally good. I will, however, argue that studying something as a moral foundation does not necessarily mean that one believes it to be moral. For example, Hahn et al. Use moral foundations theory to better understand terrorist groups, and they never come close to arguing that those groups have good morals. Haidt and Graham argue for studying a broader form of morality and seeing it as valid, while Kugler, Jost, and Noorbaloochi argue that treating these broader morals as equally valid is dangerous. Both are essentially treating moral foundations theory as if it were a political ideology. I would argue that moral foundations theory can be used as a theory to understand political ideologies without becoming one itself, because it is good science, but would be a pretty shitty political ideology. Honestly, I think treating it as one makes you much more likely to do the tiresome things I talked about Haidt doing earlier, and also possibly a whole lot worse. Okay, now let's turn down the heat a bit and talk about whether the theory of multiple moral foundations is applicable in a variety of contexts, like any good theory should be. The generalizability of moral foundations theory outside of America and outside of weird, Western, educated, industrialized, rich democratic populations has long been questioned. This is a real concern, as weird samples tend to be the most common samples in social science research. I should mention the exact meaning of some of the aspects of weird, like Western, can be ambiguous, but going into detail about that is not the point here. Also, weird is a great acronym. Possibly my second favorite psychology acronym. My favorite is BS. I have a whole video about that. Anyway, moral foundations theory was developed partially in order to account for moral diversity and the morality of non-weird peoples and cultures. So theoretically, it should be applicable to political ideology in these contexts. Haidt and Graham gathered data from Canada, Western Europe, the United Kingdom, Australia, Eastern Europe, Latin America, South Asia, and the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Africa, and East Asia, and they were able to find a correlation between moral foundations and political ideology in every one of these regions. Doug Gruel, Alper, and Yilmaz also tested moral foundations theory in a variety of weird and non-weird cultures. They found that all 5 moral foundations were present in all 30 societies they tested. While they did find that the levels of each foundation varied across weird and non-weird cultures, this in no way discredits the applicability of moral foundations theory. In fact, it actually supports the cultural learning aspect of the theory. Now let's talk about if moral foundations actually cause political ideology, because loads of things like home decor correlate to but don't cause political ideology. Yeah, I'm serious about home decor. I'll link that study below. Anyway, the causality element of moral foundations theory is, like many elements of the theory, not beyond question. Hatemi, Crabtree, and Smith have found evidence that ideology may predict moral intuitions, which is the reverse of what moral foundations theory posits. In order to determine whether moral foundations or ideology come first, they tested whether knowing moral convictions at time 1 allows for the prediction of ideology at time 2 or 3, and vice versa. Their results indicate the predictive path runs from ideology to morality. If this were true, moral foundations theory would still have some more limited usefulness, because it would be able to tell us about the morality associated with specific political ideologies. Alright, so is moral foundations theory a flawless and complete explanation of political ideology? Of course not. I said it was a problematic fave, didn't I? There are a number of valid reasons to be critical of moral foundations theory, especially the moral pluralism aspect, many of which I have detailed in the video, and some of which I did not have room for. But we should ask, does moral foundations theory work as a procedure for making sense of these competing systems of political ideas, values, and opinions? To that, the answer is a pretty confident yes for me, since it has been a useful method for a number of researchers to understand political ideology in a variety of conflicts. Essentially, a theory does not have to be perfectly correct in every aspect in order to be at least partially successful. In order to demonstrate this with regard to moral foundations theory and political ideology, I will explain a few choice examples of how it has been used to help better understand political ideology. Moral foundations theory has proven useful in examining how ideologically charged political issues are discussed. Clifford and Jarrett have used moral foundations theory to examine moral rhetoric and stem cell research. They were able to find that people on opposite sides of the debate on stem cell research have different patterns of moral rhetoric and lean on different moral foundations. They found that this moral rhetoric was consequential to the way the public thought about the issue, meaning that using moral foundations theory allowed them to determine part of how the public's ideological views are shaped on this issue. Moral foundations theory can also be usefully applied to political ideologies that are especially difficult to understand, such as those of terrorists. Hahn et al. Were able to determine that violent extremist, right-wing, and ethno-nationalist and separatist ideologies were associated with the motivations of loyalty, authority, and purity, and extremist left-wing and single-issue ideologies were associated with the motivations of care and fairness. I should clarify that all of this research was done on specifically violent groups. According to the study's authors, this has the potential to help us better understand the motivations of different terrorist groups, something that prior methods for understanding terrorism have struggled with. They also use moral foundations theory to explore how terrorists are morally engaged in spite of the heinous acts they commit. This is an excellent example of applying moral foundations theory without implying that just because someone is operating off moral foundations, they are morally good. Moral foundations theory offers a perhaps underutilized opportunity to examine the moral structures of immoral people and organizations. Another useful application of moral foundations theory is in adjusting persuasion techniques to people with different political ideologies. Day, Fisk, Downing, and Trail found that if issues are morally framed in line with the moral foundations, conservatives tend to become more conservative and liberals tend to become more liberal. They also found that if liberal issues are framed in terms of moral foundations typically associated with conservatives, then conservatives are more likely to take typically liberal stances. Interestingly, the opposite was not true. An integral part of understanding political ideologies and how they are shaped is understanding their relationship to persuasion. And in this study, moral foundations theory was able to offer an important insight on political persuasion. I think the thing to understand here is that what moral foundations theory allows us to do is to better understand those with differing morals than our own. However, understanding those morals does not mean that they and their associated ideology should not be examined critically. This understanding of the morals of more conservative people does not mean that we should become more conservative or more centrist, and in fact offers opportunities to persuade people towards causes like tolerance and combating climate change, both of which I go into more details about in other videos and apply moral foundations to. Basically, what I'm saying is that moral foundations can be used to A, become a boring centrist, or B, further worthy causes, and I think you should go with B. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and thank you so much to my patrons who really do a lot to support the channel. You can join them over on Patreon and get your pet in the credits too. Or you can support me by following me on social media, liking, subscribing, all the typical things. They're all down below the video. Thanks!